There are moments in life so desperate that words stop being requests and start becoming prayers. Imagine standing in the cold with nothing left to offer but the truth of your hunger, your fear, and the unbearable love you carry for your children. Imagine reaching a point where survival no longer means staying together, but knowing when to let go. This is not a story about charity or heroism. It is a story about what happens when humanity is tested at its absolute edge, when a single sentence spoken in desperation collides with an answer given in sacrifice. A starving widow, stripped of everything except love, makes the unthinkable request, and in response, someone who has almost nothing himself makes a choice that changes every life involved. This is where the world pauses, where judgment disappears, and where one moment proves that compassion does not require wealth, only courage. Desperation is often misunderstood because we view it through the comfort of distance. From the outside, it can look like failure, like collapse, like the moment someone has given up. But desperation is not the absence of strength, it is the final expression of it. It is what remains after every other option has been exhausted, after dignity has been swallowed, after pride has been sacrificed in the name of survival. When a person reaches desperation, it is not because they are weak. It is because they have been strong for far too long with far too little support. Desperation is born in silence. It grows quietly in empty rooms, in long nights where hunger keeps sleep away, in moments where parents lie awake calculating impossible choices. It forms when someone has tried everything they know, worked harder, prayed longer, endured quietly, and still watched their situation deteriorate. Society often praises resilience, but rarely acknowledges the cost of it. By the time desperation speaks, it has already carried the weight of responsibility, fear, and love for longer than anyone should have to carry alone. For a parent, desperation takes on a deeper meaning. It is no longer about personal suffering. It is about protecting innocent lives at any cost. When survival becomes uncertain, love transforms into sacrifice. The instinct to shield children from pain becomes so powerful that even the most unthinkable decisions start to feel necessary. This is where desperation stops looking like panic and starts looking like courage. To admit you cannot provide, to acknowledge your limits, and to seek help when pride demands silence that requires a strength few recognize. We are taught to associate dignity with self-sufficiency, but desperation exposes a different truth. Dignity also lives in honesty. There is dignity in saying, "I cannot do this alone." There is dignity in choosing the well-being of others over the illusion of control. Desperation strips away the performative version of strength and leaves behind something raw and real. It forces a person to confront reality without disguise, without comfort, without certainty, and to act anyway. In moments of desperation, language changes. Words are no longer polished or strategic. They are direct, painful, and sincere. They carry the weight of every sleepless night and every unanswered prayer. This is why desperation feels uncomfortable. To witness it reveals truths we would rather avoid. It reminds us that safety is fragile, that stability is not guaranteed, and that circumstances, not character, often determine outcomes. Instead of turning away from desperation, we should learn to listen to it, because it speaks the truth of human vulnerability. Desperation is also deeply relational. It does not emerge in isolation. It arises because someone cares deeply about something beyond themselves. People who truly have nothing left often withdraw. They shut down. Desperation, however, reaches outward. It seeks connection. It asks for mercy. It risks rejection. That outward movement is an act of hope, even when hope feels impossible. It is the belief, however faint, that someone, somewhere, might respond with humanity. When we judge desperation, we overlook the resilience that came before it. We ignore the miles already walked, the sacrifices already made, the pain already endured in silence. We forget that most people do not ask for help at the first sign of trouble. They ask when there is nothing left to trade but honesty. Desperation is not the beginning of surrender. It is the final stand of love, understanding. This changes how we see others and how we see ourselves. It teaches us to replace judgment with compassion, assumption with curiosity. It reminds us that asking for help is not a moral failure, but a human necessity. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that survival is not always loud or heroic. Sometimes survival looks like humility. Sometimes it looks like an impossible choice, and sometimes it looks like the courage to speak one final sentence that carries the weight of everything you love, trusting that someone will hear it and respond. When desperation reaches that point, it forces a person to confront a truth that is both terrifying and liberating. You cannot survive alone forever. This realization does not come easily, especially in a world that celebrates independence and self-reliance as the highest virtues. From a young age, many are taught that needing help is a weakness, that asking is an admission of failure. But desperation dismantles those lessons, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. It teaches that survival is not a solo act, it is a shared human effort. At this stage, desperation becomes a form of clarity. The noise of expectation fades, and what remains is the core purpose: protecting life, preserving dignity, and choosing the least harmful path when all options hurt. In these moments, moral simplicity replaces complexity. There is no time for appearances or approval. Every decision is measured by one question alone: will this keep them safe? This clarity, forged under pressure, is not weakness, it is the sharpest expression of love. Desperation also reveals the unevenness of the world. It exposes how quickly stability can disappear, how thin the line is between security and scarcity. Many who judge desperation do so because they have never stood at its edge. They confuse circumstance with character and luck with virtue. But desperation does not discriminate. It arrives after illness, loss, disaster, or systemic neglect. It does not ask whether someone worked hard enough or believed strongly enough. It simply arrives and demands response. This is why desperation deserves empathy, not suspicion. It is not manipulation. It is vulnerability laid bare. When someone speaks from desperation, they are offering the truth without armor. They are risking humiliation, rejection, and misunderstanding because silence is no longer an option. That risk itself is an act of courage. It takes strength to admit limits in a world that punishes exposure. Desperation also reshapes identity. A person who once defined themselves by capability, resilience, or provision may suddenly find those identities shaken. This can feel like erasure, but it is actually transformation. When old definitions fail, new ones emerge, definitions rooted not in control, but in connection. Desperation strips away false narratives of self-sufficiency and replaces them with the deeper truth of interdependence. Humans survive because we respond to one another. There is also a profound humility in desperation. It does not demand, it asks. It does not claim entitlement, it seeks mercy. This humility is often misread as defeat, but it is actually wisdom earned through suffering. It acknowledges reality without denial and faces it with honesty. In doing so, desperation opens the door for compassion to enter. Without vulnerability, compassion has no place to land. And yet, desperation is not an endpoint. It is a crossing. It marks the transition between isolation and connection, between silence and being seen. What happens next depends not only on the one who asks, but on the one who hears. Desperation calls for response. It challenges others to decide who they will be when faced with another's need. Will they turn away to preserve comfort, or will they lean in, even when it costs something? This is where desperation becomes transformative, not just for the one experiencing it, but for everyone involved. It forces a choice that reveals character. It invites humanity into a moment that could otherwise be defined by despair. And when that invitation is accepted, something remarkable occurs. Survival becomes shared, burden becomes lighter, and hope, once thought extinct, begins to breathe again. Understanding desperation this way changes how we live. It encourages us to create spaces where asking for help is not shameful, where vulnerability is met with respect, and where compassion is not conditional. It reminds us that every life is one crisis away from needing mercy and one act of kindness away from restoration. Desperation is not weakness. It is the language of survival spoken when love refuses to give up, even when everything else has. When we truly understand desperation as the language of survival, we begin to see that it is not asking for rescue, it is asking for recognition. Recognition of pain, recognition of effort, recognition of love that has endured longer than it should have had to. Desperation says, I have reached the edge, not because I didn't try, but because I tried until there was nothing left. That distinction matters, because it shifts the conversation from blame to responsibility, from judgment to humanity. In many cases, desperation is the moment when a person finally gives themselves permission to be honest. Honest about fear, honest about exhaustion, honest about the reality that strength alone is not enough. This honesty is not easy. It often comes after years of silence, of pretending things are fine, of shielding others from the truth. Desperation breaks that silence, because it must. It values survival over pride, and in doing so, it exposes a truth we often ignore. Pretending to be strong does not protect anyone, but honesty sometimes can. Desperation also reveals how deeply connected survival and trust really are. To ask for help is to trust that someone else will not misuse your vulnerability. It is to believe, even faintly, that compassion still exists in the world. This belief can feel almost irrational when life has been unkind for a long time. Yet desperation reaches for it anyway. That reach is not weakness, it is hope stripped down to its rawest form. It is the belief that humanity has not disappeared, even if circumstances suggest otherwise. There is also an important lesson here about how we respond to desperation when we encounter it. Too often, the world responds with conditions, questions, or skepticism. We ask people to explain themselves, to justify their need, to prove their worthiness. But desperation is not a debate. It is a signal. It tells us that someone has reached a limit, and limits should be met with care, not interrogation. The way we respond to desperation says more about us than it does about the one asking. When desperation is met with compassion, something shifts immediately. The burden does not disappear, but it becomes shared. The weight that was crushing one person is redistributed across connection. This is how survival turns into recovery, not through miracles, but through presence. Through someone saying, "You don't have to face this alone." That sentence, spoken sincerely, has saved more lives than we will ever know. Desperation also challenges our ideas of fairness. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality, access, and chance. Many people work just as hard, love just as deeply, and sacrifice just as much, yet face drastically different outcomes. Desperation reminds us that suffering is not always a result of bad choices, and stability is not always the result of good ones. Recognizing this does not remove personal responsibility, but it adds compassion to the equation. It reminds us that we are all more fragile than we like to admit. As listeners, as witnesses, as members of a shared society, we are called to do more than observe desperation. We are called to respond to it with humanity. That response does not always require grand solutions. Sometimes it is simply the willingness to listen without judgment, to help without conditions, to see without suspicion. These small acts carry enormous power because they restore dignity in moments when it feels lost. Ultimately, desperation teaches us that survival is not only about endurance, it is about connection. No one survives alone forever, and no one should have to. When we honor desperation for what it truly is, the final, brave language of survival, we create a world where asking for help is not an act of shame, but a step toward healing. And in that world, compassion stops being optional and becomes essential, because it is not charity that saves lives, it is shared humanity. At this stage, something profound becomes clear. Desperation is not meant to be silenced or dismissed. It is meant to be answered. When someone reaches that breaking point and speaks from it, they are not just expressing need, they are offering an opportunity for connection, for responsibility, for humanity to show itself in real time. Desperation exposes a crossroad where two paths emerge, one of indifference, where the world keeps moving and the vulnerable are left behind, and one of compassion, where someone chooses to step into discomfort and say, "I see you." What makes desperation so powerful is that it forces truth into the open. It strips away social masks, polite conversations, and surface-level interactions. It demands that we respond not as spectators, but as participants, and that demand can feel unsettling, because responding to desperation often costs something: time, comfort, resources, emotional energy. Yet it is precisely this cost that gives compassion its meaning. If kindness were easy, it would not transform lives. It is the willingness to give when giving is inconvenient that restores hope. Desperation also teaches us about courage in a form we rarely celebrate. We often associate courage with confidence, boldness, or triumph. But desperation reveals another kind of courage: the courage to admit fear, to accept uncertainty, to risk rejection for the sake of those you love. This courage does not stand tall and proud. It bends, it kneels, it asks, and in doing so, it reveals a strength rooted not in dominance, but in devotion. There is a quiet heroism in choosing honesty over appearance when everything is on the line, in choosing the well-being of others over the protection of your own ego. Desperation forces that choice, and when someone chooses love in that moment, it redefines what strength truly means. Strength is no longer about holding everything together alone. It becomes about knowing when to reach outward. For those who witness desperation and choose to respond with compassion, transformation occurs on both sides. Helping someone at their lowest does not diminish you, It expands you. It reminds you of your own humanity, of your capacity to matter in someone else's story. It grounds you in a reality deeper than success or comfort. The reality that our lives are intertwined, that survival is shared, and that meaning is often found in moments of mutual vulnerability. Desperation also carries a warning for all of us. It reminds us how quickly life can change, how fragile security truly is. No one plans to arrive at desperation. It comes through loss, illness, economic collapse, or circumstances beyond control. Recognizing this truth should humble us. It should soften our judgments and sharpen our empathy, because the line between stability and desperation is thinner than we think, and none of us are immune to crossing it. When desperation is met with compassion, it does not erase hardship, but it reframes it. It turns a moment of crisis into a moment of connection. It transforms isolation into belonging, and that transformation is what allows people not just to survive, but to begin rebuilding. Recovery does not start with abundance. It starts with dignity, with being seen, with being treated as human rather than as a problem to be solved. Ultimately, desperation teaches us that the measure of a society or an individual is not how it treats the successful, but how it responds to those at the edge. When someone speaks the final language of survival, the response they receive can either deepen despair or ignite hope, and hope, once reignited, has the power to carry people through unimaginable darkness. So when desperation speaks, listen. Listen without judgment. Listen without conditions. Because in that moment, you are not just hearing a story of need, you are being invited into a moment where your response can change the direction of a life. And there is no greater responsibility or privilege than choosing to answer with humanity. At this stage, something profound becomes clear. Desperation is not meant to be silenced or dismissed. It is meant to be answered. When someone reaches that breaking point and speaks from it, they are not just expressing need, they are offering an opportunity for connection, for responsibility, for humanity to show itself in real time. Desperation exposes a crossroad where two paths emerge, one of indifference, where the world keeps moving and the vulnerable are left behind, and one of compassion, where someone chooses to step into discomfort and say, I see you. What makes desperation so powerful is that it forces truth into the open. It strips away social masks, polite conversations, and surface-level interactions. It demands that we respond not as spectators, but as participants, and that demand can feel unsettling, because responding to desperation often costs something: time, comfort, resources, emotional energy. Yet it is precisely this cost that gives compassion its meaning. If kindness were easy, it would not transform lives. It is the willingness to give when giving is inconvenient that restores hope. Desperation also teaches us about courage in a form we rarely celebrate. We often associate courage with confidence, boldness, or triumph. But desperation reveals another kind of courage: the courage to admit fear, to accept uncertainty, to risk rejection for the sake of those you love. This courage does not stand tall and proud. It bends, it kneels, it asks, and in doing so, it reveals a strength rooted not in dominance, but in devotion. There is a quiet heroism in choosing honesty over appearance when everything is on the line, in choosing the well-being of others over the protection of your own ego. Desperation forces that choice, and when someone chooses love in that moment, it redefines what strength truly means. Strength is no longer about holding everything together alone. It becomes about knowing when to reach outward. For those who witness desperation and choose to respond with compassion, transformation occurs on both sides. Helping someone at their lowest does not diminish you, it expands you. It reminds you of your own humanity, of your capacity to matter in someone else's story. It grounds you in a reality deeper than success or comfort. The reality that our lives are intertwined, that survival is shared, and that meaning is often found in moments of mutual vulnerability. Desperation also carries a warning for all of us. It reminds us how quickly life can change, how fragile security truly is. No one plans to arrive at desperation. It comes through loss, illness, economic collapse, or circumstances beyond control. Recognizing this truth should humble us. It should soften our judgments and sharpen our empathy, because the line between stability and desperation is thinner than we think, and none of us are immune to crossing it. When desperation is met with compassion, it does not erase hardship, but it reframes it. It turns a moment of crisis into a moment of connection. It transforms isolation into belonging, and that transformation is what allows people not just to survive, but to begin rebuilding. Recovery does not start with abundance. It starts with dignity, with being seen, with being treated as human rather than as a problem to be solved. Ultimately, desperation teaches us that the measure of a society or an individual is not how it treats the successful, but how it responds to those at the edge. When someone speaks the final language of survival, the response they receive can either deepen despair or ignite hope, and hope, once reignited, has the power to carry people through unimaginable darkness. So when desperation speaks, listen. Listen without judgment. Listen without conditions. Because in that moment, you are not just hearing a story of need, you are being invited into a moment where your response can change the direction of a life. And there is no greater responsibility or privilege than choosing to answer with humanity. When desperation is finally answered with humanity, something shifts in the air, almost imperceptibly at first, but powerful enough to change everything that follows. The fear does not vanish, the hardship does not magically dissolve, but the crushing sense of being alone begins to loosen its grip. In that moment, survival is no longer a solitary burden, it becomes a shared journey, and that shared weight, however heavy, is always lighter than carrying it alone. This is why desperation, when met with compassion, becomes the doorway to transformation rather than the end of the road. There is a quiet restoration that happens when someone realizes they are no longer invisible. To be seen in your worst moment, to be acknowledged without shame or interrogation, restores something fundamental that hardship often steals: dignity. Dignity is not pride. It is the belief that your life has value, even when you have nothing left to offer. Desperation threatens that belief. Compassion rebuilds it. And once dignity is restored, the spirit begins to rise, even in the most difficult circumstances. This is also where responsibility changes its meaning. Instead of being a crushing force that isolates, it becomes a bond that connects. When someone chooses to step forward in response to desperation, they are not simply offering help, they are accepting shared responsibility for another human life. This choice is never convenient, but it is deeply meaningful. It reminds us that responsibility is not always assigned by obligation or law. Sometimes it is chosen in a single, defining moment of conscience. Desperation also reveals the profound impact of simple decisions. History is often told through grand events, but lives are changed through small, courageous choices. A willingness to say yes when it would be easier to say no, a refusal to turn away when discomfort arises. These moments rarely make headlines, yet they alter the course of generations. One act of compassion can interrupt cycles of suffering that have existed for years, sometimes lifetimes. For the one who asked from desperation, the response they receive becomes a mirror reflecting what the world believes about them. When the response is rejection, it reinforces fear and isolation. But when the response is acceptance, it redefines their sense of worth. It tells them that their life matters, that their struggle is seen, that their future is not already written by their hardship. That message can sustain someone through challenges that would otherwise feel unbearable. For the one who responds with compassion, the experience is equally transformative. It confronts them with their own fears and limitations, yet it also expands their understanding of purpose. Helping in moments of desperation often reshapes priorities, reminding us that meaning is not found in accumulation, but in contribution. It grounds us in something timeless, the truth that we are measured not by what we keep, but by what we are willing to share. Desperation also teaches us about legacy. The way we respond to others at their lowest becomes part of our story, whether we acknowledge it or not. Children learn what the world is like by watching how adults treat the vulnerable. Communities are defined by how they protect or abandon their weakest members. When compassion answers desperation, it creates a legacy of care that extends beyond the immediate moment, shaping values, expectations, and future choices. In the end, desperation is not a flaw in the human experience. It is a signal of how deeply we care. It arises because love refuses to give up, even when resources are gone and hope feels thin. And when that love is met with compassion, something sacred happens. Survival becomes shared, pain becomes bearable, and the possibility of rebuilding emerges where none seemed to exist before. This is why desperation deserves our respect, not our judgment. It is the final language of survival spoken by those who have endured more than most. When we learn to listen and, more importantly, to respond, we do more than help someone in need. We reaffirm the truth that humanity, at its best, shows up precisely when it is needed most. And this is the message that must stay with us long after the story ends. Desperation is not the collapse of a person, it is the final proof of their love, their courage, and their refusal to let the people they care about disappear into suffering. When someone reaches that moment and speaks from it, they are not asking for pity, they are asking for humanity. And how we respond in those moments defines who we are far more than our comfort, our success, or our resources ever could. This world will always have hunger, loss, and hardship. No amount of progress will erase the fact that people will one day stand at the edge of what they can endure. But we are not powerless in the face of that reality. Every one of us carries the ability to change the direction of a life, not through grand gestures, but through presence, courage, and compassion. One choice to see instead of judge. One decision to help instead of turn away. One moment of humanity when it matters most. Remember this: dignity is not something people lose when they become desperate. It is something the world takes when it refuses to listen. And hope is not something reserved for the fortunate. It is something we create for one another. When someone offers you their truth in their darkest hour, they are trusting you with something sacred. What you do with that trust can echo far beyond that moment. So let this story challenge you. Let it soften you. Let it remind you that strength is not measured by how little you need others, but by how willing you are to respond when others need you. Because in the end, the greatest act of survival is not enduring alone, it is choosing humanity together.